Jon Stewart has been doing some remarkable work, and although his recent coverage of the climate crisis sometimes goes badly off the rails, there are still some vital moments within it. Stewart correctly notes that the climate situation is much worse than mainstream coverage leads us to believe, that the vast majority of the emissions are committed by a tiny number of capitalist corporations, that those who will be most harmed by the damage of climate change are the poorest and smallest contributors to the crisis, though it is constantly implied that the solutions lie in small actions taken by individual consumers, often blaming the victim. While politicians wax poetical about conserving the environment, they fund fossil fuel corporations with government subsidies and renege on even the most basic foreign aid packages to the poorest countries to help them develop renewable energy. In one particularly chilling moment, the CEO of Shell Oil straight up tells Stewart, "We may simply have to go over 1.5 degrees Celsius and use the second half of the century to clean up." In a country that has already seen its life expectancy in decline for 6 years, this is fast becoming a bleak, best case scenario vision of the future. Stewart covers all of this marvelously, but then he veers way off course. It's no use appealing to the better angels of our nature, he says, to solve the climate crisis. It takes two to tango, and we are addicted to the standard of living fossil fuels prop up. We freak out when the price of gas goes up because of the Ukraine crisis. We have hissy fits in Trader Joe's over mask mandates. Instead, we have to appeal to the greed of the fossil fuel corporations, give them so much money to make green energy that it becomes more profitable than producing fossil fuels, and bribe them to save the world. Yet there are not actually two tangoing here. Throughout his series, Stewart fails to distinguish between markets and capitalism. Self-employment is not capitalism. Worker-owned democratic companies are not capitalist. And member-owned cooperatives are not capitalist. Capitalism is specifically when there is a division of workers and owners, and the workers are organized from above to labor for the profits of the owners. If the working class that does not call the shots has for decades been arguing for jobs in their communities, affordable housing in their communities, and better public transit, but the corporations and their friends in government have been going in the opposite direction, then to turn around and blame the workers for getting into their cars that they had to purchase to commute to their capitalist jobs, for getting upset that the cost of gas they have to pay to go to their capitalist jobs has gone up, is both a logical fallacy and the very victim blaming that Stewart sought to critique. The city I live in, St. Catharines, Ontario, about an hour south of Toronto, actually used to have electric public transit called streetcars running through it a century ago. But St. Catharines became home to a General Motors plant, and like many communities, it saw governments and corporations make deals to tear up and pave over the streetcar lines to push people into purchasing cars. Today, the General Motors plant is all but gone, but we are told that electric public transit is now too expensive to implement. In the mid-20th century, we developed what political economist E.F. Schumacher called megapolises, a handful of huge cities to which all the jobs flocked. Millions of citizens deserted smaller communities, left their homes, and moved to those big cities in pursuit of those jobs. The cities, in turn, quickly became so expensive and unlivable that people had to move back out of those cities to smaller communities like St. Catharines, Ontario. But the jobs were still in the cities, so now they had to commute back to the cities they had just moved out of and go back and forth in order to have employment. Without European-style public transit and high-speed rail, which commuters constantly begged for, workers now found themselves en masse stuck in rush hour. Over the past 5 years, I personally have worked 2 part-time teaching jobs in Toronto. Sometimes those trips take 3, even 4 hours one way because the traffic gets so bad. I can promise you, I am not addicted to that standard of living. Indeed, one of the highest predictors of workplace satisfaction is how close one lives to where one works. In my interview with Dr. Gar Alperovitz of the Democracy Collaborative, he explained how throwaway cities are a huge environmental cost.
One of the things that's happening in many parts of the country are what I call throwaway cities. That is to say, a big company leaves and leaves behind the wreckage of displaced people, displaced housing, displaced factories, and then builds it someplace else. So ecologically, it's ridiculous.
This is exactly the kind of corporate activity working class movements across the spectrum have been protesting ever since NAFTA was rammed down our throats 30 years ago. But these deserting companies are not controlled by their workers. nor are they controlled by their community members. Meanwhile, in the last Canadian federal election, climate ranked as the #1 concern among voters over even the economy and the pandemic. It might take two to tango, but it takes one to stomp. Corporate oil did this, not us. While your average citizen might not be an over-the-top angel, they're perfectly willing to take practical steps in addition to their full-time jobs to benefit the common good. Community after community collects their garbage, recycling, compost. Tens of millions of people bring fabric bags into grocery stores, reusable cups into coffee shops, reduce their meat intake, go vegetarian or vegan. And while there might be the odd outburst at Trader Joe's, the fact is that almost everyone across Canada and the United States got at least one vaccination shot and has taken years of health precautions throughout this crisis, despite mixed messages from governments and corporate profiteering that we all actually should be very upset about. We, of course, must absolutely fully bail out any displaced workers in the coming transition. And if it comes down to it and we have to give huge fortunes of compensation to corporate owners and executives as we nationalize their companies and take them under public control, fine, let's do it. I will not cut off my nose to spite my face. Let's just deal with the issue. But let's also be perfectly clear. These corporate owners and executives do not have the excuses of those who have supported murderous regimes in the past. They were not vulnerable to crazy theories after years of economic deprivation. They did not face death or concentration camps if they opposed power. These are the wealthiest people in the history of the world, and they have done their damage and are doing their damage in full knowledge of the consequences of their crimes. They have spent fortunes bribing politicians and funding misinformation campaigns, and when peaceful Indigenous protesters got in their way, they did not hesitate to collaborate with the government to bring out the tear gas and the attack dogs and the rubber bullets. There is nothing immoral, unfair, or problematic about removing their corporate property from them without any compensation at all.